I'm Wendy Corsi Staub, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Wendy Corsi Staub.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. There are handy links over in the sidebar on the right-hand side where you can subscribe to the show. You can find all of the archives in a handy little drop-down list, or there's a search bar where you can search for your favorite author and see if they have been on the show in these past more than 400 episodes. Thank you to our sponsors for allowing us to do this. And we've got some new sponsors coming on. Daniel Kinney, my favorite middle grade author, is just doing amazing things right now. He is publishing like a madman, but he's putting out excellent books. I buy his books for my nieces and nephews all the time. My kids are a little older now, but my nieces and nephews, I buy Daniel's books and put them in their hands. They are top shelf quality and really fun books. There's a link to Daniel's Amazon page in the show notes, and we're going to be highlighting more of his books as we go on this month. But go visit Daniel Kinney and buy his books for your favorite kids, and they will love it. Roy M. Griffiths has a new book, Bringing the Fire, The Lonesome George Chronicles, Book 2. Roy is really doing some amazing stuff in speculative fiction, and we're going to be highlighting more of those as the month goes on. But go pick up Roy's newest books. There's a link to it in the show notes. If you're a fan of alternative history or war and military thrillers, you're going to love these books. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, thanks to my buddies Nick and Jason from Galaxy's Edge for sponsoring the show. I would like to welcome back as a sponsor to the show, Nick Breaker and his fantastic series, Essence. Book 1, Septima, and Book 2, Alta, are out now. Nick is feverishly working to release Book 3 now. It's in editing, and you are going to absolutely love this series. Troy, with his irrational fears, is the least likely person to lead a war, but that doesn't mean he can escape his destiny. This fantastic science fiction action series is full of great characters, great character development, lots of action, and lots of weird science fiction goodness. If you love a great character-driven story with great science fiction, you are going to love this series, Essence. 2 books are out now. Book 1, Essence. Book 2, Alta. And the 3rd book will be here soon. Get into this series now. Everyone's talking about it. Thank you, Nick Breaker. Thanks for tuning in. As always, at the end of the show, we have an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. He enlisted for the money. He stayed for the girl. Gateway to the Galaxy, the new series everyone is talking about, beginning with Book 1, Into the Breach. Frank and Marine Space Corps 1 find themselves across the galaxy in a WWE smackdown with the legions of a boss-level villain. But the party's just getting started. He donned the mantle of a celestial knight to impress a girl? Well, an empress. Now destiny's calling in a debt. A lightning-paced military fantasy full of outlandish comedy and impossible situations that will have you hailing for these Marines from the get-go. For fans of Green Lantern and the Stargate universe. Listen to what some readers are saying. This is good stuff. Thanks for the new obsession. I recommend and can't wait for the next book. And the visual pictures and action are amazing. They're getting the band back together, and this time, it's serious nonsense. Pick up the Gateway to the Galaxy series by Jonathan Yanez and J.R. Castle, available now on Amazon.com. There's a link to it in the show notes. Gateway to the Galaxy. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have Wendy Corsi Staub on the show with me. She has a brand new book out, and when you're hearing this episode, the book is out and available now for you to purchase. So run out and get it. You're going to love this. Wendy is one of the most prolific writers I think I've ever gotten to talk to, and I'm sure this episode is going to be full of writerly goodness. Welcome to the show, Wendy.
Thank you so much. Thanks. And thank you for saying such nice things.
Well, it's all true. But Wendy, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh my gosh, mine is vivid, and anyone who's ever heard me speak in person is probably sick of hearing the story, but because I have a show and tell that I do with it, actually. I was in third grade in my little hometown in western New York, and my third grade teacher, Mrs. Pizzolanti, gave us the assignment to write an essay about someone we admired. And that was the first time I'd ever written anything or been asked to write anything. And, everybody else was complaining, and I was secretly thrilled because I loved it. And I was an Abraham Lincoln fan. I had read every book about him in the library, and my parents had taken us to Springfield. And so I was really into Lincoln, and I wrote about him. And when she handed the essays back a few days later, I remember, she singled me out, and I was really shy and embarrassed. And it turned out she was telling me that, you did a great job. You should keep writing. You're good at it. And I remember clearly that I went home from school that day and told my mom and dad that, I wanted to be a writer when I grow up because my teacher said I was good at it. And so years later, actually that's the show and tell part, years later, after my mom passed away, I had thought, maybe my mind embellished that little story over the years because I do make things up for a living. And I found, after my mom passed away, in her cedar chest, I found my baby book, and there was the Abe Lincoln essay, and there was a little hole at the top where they had, as I had remembered, that she had put it up on the board to single it out. She tacked it up, and, it was real, just as I remembered it. So I carry that around now. It's framed in my office, but I always take it to show school children.
That is so cool. I love to hear those stories. And, there's a reason I asked that question at the beginning of the show. It always puts us, in a good place mentally, because most writers have known that they are writers or want to be writers or have the storytelling gene. They've known it for a long, long time. And, remembering back to that first, awakening, always makes me excited and excited to hear that from people. And I talk about it all the time. I know people get sick of hearing me say it, but, there's something about that first encounter with an adult when you're a kid that encourages you and tells you that you can do something. And it's such a lot of times it's just a throwaway compliment, that someone, and they have no idea that you are going to hang on to that your entire life. And
no.
Then, and it's such a simple thing to do for a kid. And, when you recognize that in someone, listeners out there, please take a moment to encourage them and tell them. You just never know when someone's going to hang on to that, and it's going to be the thing that keeps them going in the darkest of times.
That's true. And it the postscript to my story, I love that you said that, because the flip side is, my old teacher, I had lost track of her, obviously, after third grade, but I was giving an interview I come from the western New York area, so a Buffalo newspaper had interviewed me about a book, years later, like maybe about a decade ago. And they asked me if a teacher had ever inspired me, and I told that story, and I mentioned her by name. She had retired to Florida, but someone saw it and got in touch with her, and she ended up calling the bookstore where I was signing that night, and we got back in touch. And it was such a gift. She remembered that I loved to write. She did remember, but she had no idea that she'd had such an impact. And we were pen pals for the last, I think, probably 5 or 6 years of her life. She died on my birthday, and it was a few years back, but it was such a gift because then she followed my career, and she was proud, and we never did get I signed in her town a few months after she died. Sadly, I didn't get there in time, but I got to tell her thank you, and she, as a teacher, was thrilled to know that something she had said had made such an impact, and she never would have known. So just as you should encourage anyone, especially our children, really thank someone if you ever have an opportunity to thank somebody and reach them out and tell them they made an impact on your life, because that was a gift for me and for her. So,
I have a high school teacher that was a huge impact on me, Mr. Keene, and I got back in touch with him a few years ago, and I dedicated one of my books to him in the front of the book, and he has it on his mantle, and he shows it to everyone that comes at his house, and it just it makes me smile every time. It's
that's so great.
Thing.
Yeah. That's and all around good stuff. The world is so difficult and there's so much negative energy out there. I love hearing stories like that. So good. Yay.
So your teacher encouraged you, your parents, obviously, when you went to tell them, what was their reaction when you said you're going to be a writer?
I was so lucky. I still have my dad. My mom died pretty young, but I still have my dad, and he's front and center every time I sign, if he can be there, no matter where I am. Like, they were so supportive, and and my dad is a banker. I'm like the creative, flighty person in the family, and he was very pragmatic, and he always said, you need an education, you have to get a college degree, and that was the one thing I didn't want to do. I wanted to just move to New York City. I thought that's where writers lived. I wanted to move to New York City and write books. And my mom is a teacher, and my dad, they're like, great, you can do that, but first get your degree, go to college, and then you can make it happen, but you have to work really hard, and they prepared me for that reality. So they were wonderful, and I was a Little House on the Prairie fan when I was a kid, and they drove us across the country to see all of her houses. Like, those were the parents that I had, and I was blessed. I was really lucky.
I love that. So what did you study in college?
Oh, English literature and writing, creative writing.
Obviously.
Yep. And I went kicking and screaming, but in the end, it was, again, another gift in my life. You don't realize it at the time, but, oh, God, I had to grow up, and I had to, you might not learn how to write, although I did take some great creative writing workshops, but you learn how to take criticism, take feedback, I worked in a bookstore, so I learned it as a business, and it was essential to my career, I think.
Working in a bookstore, you get to see a lot of books that come in and become popular, and that's a great thing to study when you see, why something really takes off, and sometimes it's, you may look at it and say, why would this book be the one that breaks out,
Oh, God, yeah.
But you also get to see a lot of great books that no one ever discovers. And did your time in the bookstore teach you anything about the business that you still recall today?
Oh, my God. It taught me everything about the business. It taught me that it is a business, because when when you're a kid especially and you want to be a writer, you think it's just about sitting down and writing stories. So craft is one piece of it, learning craft. It's like anything else. You have to learn how to do it. But the other piece of it is to see the art that you're creating as a product that you need to sell. That's the only way you can turn your passion into a business. You have to sell something and be able to support yourself if that's what you want. So being in the bookstore taught me, I read everything in the store, and I would love certain books, but, other people didn't, and they didn't sell well, and I had to realize, commercial fiction and becoming a commercial author is one thing, and, writing for the pure joy of it is something quite different. And the other thing that it taught me, so in addition to sort of what sells and what doesn't and why people pick up a certain book, was, which publishers are publishing which authors. And, my job on Saturdays was to arrange the New York Times bestsellers of the previous week, or the upcoming week, I guess it was, in order on the shelf. And I thought, I want to be one of these authors. I want to be successful like this. That was a goal I had at that time, because I saw the people coming in and sweeping up those books, knowing very little about them, actually. Sometimes it was funny. But yeah, it's just such a strange business, and I think that it kind of grounded me, and it allowed me to detach myself from my passionate art, my creativity. My creative side still tries to take over sometimes, but after all these years, you have to learn. It's not personal when something doesn't work or doesn't sell, or. So I think that was really key for a person like me.
So what was the first novel that you wrote?
Oh, God. Well, the first one that I wrote was probably in 4th grade. Very different from the first one that I sold. I really wanted to write young adult novels.
Yeah.
I was reading them even in college and as a young adult. And back then it wasn't as popular as it is now to do that, so I kind of hid them in my textbooks. But I wrote a young adult novel called Summer Lightning. That was the first one I sold in 1992, May 18th, 1992, 5-something p.m. I remember the moment of getting that phone call.
Of course you do.
So,
it was a life-changing experience for you, I would imagine.
Oh, God, yes. And I was working as an editor at the time. I did move to New York. I became an editor. I was acquiring women's fiction. And so I was in the business on the other end. Again, I learned more behind the scenes. Working for a publisher did the same thing. But that's where I was when I got that phone call. And yeah, I screamed so loudly that everybody heard on the floor.
That's so you started in a bookstore. You worked at a publisher as an editor. In seeing the business from that other side, what do you think you picked up from that experience that has held with you? Now, did it teach you the you saw what sells on this side? Did being an editor did you kind of get more of the craft end of it?
I got craft end because I was editing other authors, and I'll never forget, I was handed a manuscript for one of the biggest authors in the world. One of my bosses handed me a manuscript to line edit, and I took it upon myself to rewrite. That was my first assignment. I started rewriting her book because I wanted to be an author, and I wasn't really clear on what editing was versus sort of rewriting so I learned a really big lesson on that first day. Like, you do not rewrite somebody's work. You have to find their vision, and you have to sort of nurture and bring that out, cultivate that. So as an editor, I learned that, and as an author, I think I'm a pretty good author to work with because I let the editor do her job, and I trust that her job is not my job. We don't have the same job. My job is to write the book. Her job is to hone it into something that can sell. So I learned that really early on. And that poor author, who shall remain nameless, and it sure hasn't hurt her. And they did undo everything I had undone. But yeah, that was a key lesson. That, and also just the pure joy of sitting on the other end of the desk and making that great phone call to buy other authors' books, it really made me want to receive that call myself. It fast-forwarded my goals, if anything, and made me more passionate and more ambitious.
Well, you have gone on to author more than 90 novels, and your bio photo on your website, you're like 30 years old. So that's you've written like 3 novels a year your entire life.
Well, not 30. It's probably an old photo or good lighting. But yeah, no, I've always been very driven. I'm very type A, and I'm a pretty fast writer. I used to be until I hit a certain milestone birthday a few years ago, and now I'm like, wow, I'm tired. But anyway, I've always been a pretty fast writer, so I wrote under other names. I was, I was really prolific, and early in my career, I was a young adult novelist, and those books are not like my current ones, 110, 120,000 words. Those books were shorter, so I did a lot of just a lot of young adult novels. I did ghostwriting. I did all kinds of projects. But I was fast, and I was prolific, and I was absolutely passionate about it. And I also was a terrible corporate employee, and I never wanted to go back to a day job, and especially after my boys were born. I wanted to be able to stay home with them, so I was determined to do whatever I could to keep selling.
Well, not wanting a day job is a powerful motivator.
Oh, yes. Although these days, I have to say, looking back, after 25 or more years, I guess, there's something to be said for being able to take a day off and sort of get paid when you're taking a day off. Because now you realize when you work for yourself, that's always there, and it's always a juggling act, and you get tired of it after a while, and you think, wow, it would be nice not to carry it to my bed at night and lie awake thinking about the story I have to write, or working around the clock. It's a double-edged sword, just like any job. So now I can definitely see the upside. Insurance benefits and a solid, steady paycheck coming in would be, something that I gave up years and years ago and thought I'd never think would be important again. And now you look and say, wow, I'm tired.
Something about the
Saturday off.
Something about the grass always being greener. Or
it is.
Yeah,
that's exactly what it is. Yep. And you don't, for so many years I was just so busy and so happy to be so busy. And I think it's because what it is, you realize you're not going to retire when you're a writer, because you have to write. I want to write. I am not myself unless I'm writing. But around me now, people are retiring. And I think, that's not something I'm going to do. I'm just going to write for the rest of my life because I love it and I have to. I'm tired some days.
Well, you began writing for young readers, teens, and YA. You've also written a good bit of women's fiction and a lot of suspense. When you began, did you see yourself as a YA writer, or did you categorize yourself at all, or were you thinking, this is what I want to write right now? I do want to write in other genres, or did it just kind of grow and change naturally?
No, actually, I saw myself as a YA writer, and I never wanted to be anything else necessarily. I wanted to write YA. I loved mysteries and suspense. It was selling like hotcakes when I sold, so I just assumed that I had found my calling and my niche, and I that's what I wanted to do. When the market dried up, my publisher had to call and say that they were canceling the YA imprint. They weren't going to be publishing those kinds of books anymore. And he's the one who suggested that I try writing an adult mystery. So I did that purely for sort of career and commercial and practical reasons. I mean, we had a mortgage to pay, and, I needed to do that. I tried the adult fiction. I tried to write an adult suspense novel, and I wrote it in past tense like I thought you had to. But my voice in YA was always present tense, and present tense, third person. Oh, God, sorry. I haven't had enough coffee today. Anyway, present tense was my comfort zone, and I didn't think I'd be able to do that. So the first pass at an adult novel was so flat because I really was a YA author. He suggested, it was the wonderful John Sconamiglio, who's now editor-in-chief at Kensington. We kind of grew up together, and he was my editor for years. But he suggested that I give it a whirl in present tense because that's where I felt comfortable, and that made me find my voice again as an adult author. But it was really alarming for me for a while there to think, oh, my God, I'm never going to sell another book, because I can't write this.
And it probably made you stand out in that space because there's not a lot of that going on in that space.
There wasn't at the time. I've been happy to see lately that more and more people are doing that. I felt like there were rules that I really had to follow and that I had broken a really important one. And, occasionally I would hear from readers who would say, I just can't read it in present tense. To me, it kind of lent an immediacy to the story. I liked it. But like I said, it was a learning curve. It was really rough to do, and I just didn't think it was something that I was capable of doing.
YA really went through a change about a decade or so ago where everything had to be post-apocalyptic and really dour and so it's weird when you're writing in that space and doing well at it, and then all of a sudden it's like the taste changes, and you have to be willing to roll with it and go do something else, and hopefully YA comes back around when everybody's finished being depressed.
Yes, exactly. Yes, because it does come around again. And actually, I had two resurgences, I guess, as a YA author. The market had changed, the readers had changed, and the expectation had changed because now we're living in an instant gratification world. Right. So even, the craft, I had to relearn it. But yeah, I feel like I couldn't write that dystopic fiction that was so popular. I wanted to think that I could, but I'm really not very good at it. So yeah, I think you have to be practical and think, okay, I do have limitations, yes, and I'm doing well in other things. I was not meant to write, The Hunger Games or something like it. Although if I could have, boy, that would be nice.
Well, yeah, I think we all wish we would have struck that vein of gold somewhere.
Yeah.
Publishing is a little bit like politics, and we don't really talk politics, but
right.
But what I mean is that if you watch the history of the country for long enough, you see that the pendulum usually swings way to the left, and then after a term or two, it swings way to the right, and we just kind of go back and forth and back and forth, and right. and most people are kind of in the middle there somewhere, but they get represented as the pendulum swings. But publishing is kind of like that. We go, these trends hit and everyone rushes over to this side. And then, when the Hunger Games has just freaked everybody out for too long, then we swing back to, some hopeful stories and.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So never give up on, that the market has changed. Things come back around.
No, and never try to predict the market. That's the other thing, because for a while there I was really thinking, well, what will be the next big trend, but you can't. People will say, write the story you want to write, and it'll find a market. I believe that to an extent. I don't think there's always a market for the story you want to write, at least maybe not that month. but yeah, you can't imagine what the next big thing will be. So you can go crazy trying, and I'll admit, I'm a volatile personality, and over the years, that confidence has ebbed and flowed. It's tough, and you do learn. You cannot, and you can't write to the market if it doesn't feel comfortable.
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and I sound like I'm contradicting myself, because I did say, I did learn to write adult novels, but they were in the same vein as what I was already writing. They felt comfortable, not like I was trying to fill someone else's shoes.
When you've written as many novels as you have, for as long as you have, is there a certain amount of reader loyalty that factors into that when things change, people follow you because they love you as a writer?
Yes, and I love them, and it's become sort of like my extended family. I know that sounds really cheesy, but I am so grateful because this business is cutthroat, and I have so many people who read me as children, and then they'll come to my signings now with their kids, and their kids are grown up, and it's awesome. I'm just floored by this level of support by my readers. So I do write for them. I write, yes, because it's my job and it's my career and it's my passion, but I also take them into consideration. And I just, this Lilydale series that I recently published, I had done a YA one years ago, and my YA readers wanted more, and the publisher dropped the series, and I got so many letters from readers that I thought, I've got to find a way to make this work again. So I sort of updated it, and it's an adult series, completely different. But anyway, that's because of my readers. I thought I owe them for their support after all these years, and I really try to listen to them and give back.
I think I first discovered your writing with what you call your social media thrillers.
Oh yeah.
What was the first one? The Good Sister, was that right?
The Good Sister. Yep. That was a few years back.
Yeah, but that's a great example of taking a genre that's really hot. Suspense and psychological suspense are just like uber hot right now. Lots of good stuff coming out in that space, and then finding something going on in the real world that's fertile soil, and looking for a way to really manipulate people's neuroses.
That's exactly. Oh yeah. As a mom, I mean, paranoia to the nth degree the second my first child was born, and yeah, I mind that. I think it's therapeutic too for me personally, but yeah, the world is a dangerous place, and I've always thought that the worst fears that you have are like sort of terrible things happening in the place where you feel safest, your home and your safe little town. And so, yeah, that's absolutely part of it.
Yeah, we have 5 kids. Our youngest is 14 now. Our oldest is about to be 23, and and they're all boys except for 3 girls. And but it's a dangerous world that we live in now, and I think Stephen King said it best when someone asked him why he writes scary books, and he said that his mom told him that if you find the absolute worst thing that could happen and you speak it out loud, then it won't come true. And that as writers, that's kind of what we do. We look for these things that can be cathartic for us, and we write the worst case scenario so that we know we've already faced that fear. And then if something bad happens, we know what to do with it.
We do. We've sort of already been there, done that, and we're prepared. And I think it's, people always ask me, are you afraid while you're writing your book? I'm like, I'm not afraid because I'm in control. It's the loss of control that's terrifying, right? So you think, that's you said it perfectly. That's exactly what it is.
Let's talk about your writing process for just a minute. Being as prolific as you are you an outliner? Do you have the project laid out before you start? Or are you a discovery writer? When you get an idea for a project, how much goes into the preparation for it before the actual writing?
That's such a great question. And God, I wish I could say I was an outliner because life would be so much easier, I am a pantser, I write by the seat of my pants, but I spend a lot of time preparing in terms of research. I'm reading and I'm traveling and I'm absorbing, but I don't put it on paper necessarily, I guess is the way to say it. Like I'm not creating meticulous notes ahead of time. I'm sort of filing it away. So my process is write and rewrite constantly. I do one draft, but it's constantly in revision until the day it's done, and then it is done. And I try to let secondary characters come forward if they need to, that kind of thing. It sounds all mystical, but it's not. It's more like, wow, I like this character, and I'm going to see where this takes me. So, yeah. And everybody has a different process. There's no right or wrong way.
Oh, of course not. Yeah.
And I always feel like, beginning writers will say, like, maybe I'm doing it wrong. And it's like, no, you have to find what works for you. And God, an outline, like I always, even the last few books, because I feel like life would be so much easier. They're continued stories. I mean, they're series and there are a lot of details I need to keep track of. I always think, wow, if I could just sit down and come up with a Bible that was very detailed and an outline, but I never managed to do that.
It's because you're too busy writing.
I'm too busy writing and seeing where it takes me. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah. When you talked about it, the book always being in revision. So what does that look like practically? Do you sit down each day to write and go over the previous day's writing to get back in the flow and fix anything, or kind of what does that look like for you? I start in the morning by reading what I did the day before, absolutely, and that's my springboard. I read it and I rewrite it as I'm going, and that's how I get into writing the fresh scenes. I always write in a linear way. Well,
I should say I have always in the past written the book linearly, and all the scenes are in order, unfolding. But the last couple of books, I think it's because they're pretty complex storylines. I've moved so many scenes around and have found myself now giving myself permission to write a later scene that I know is coming. I have multiple viewpoints, so sometimes if I'm in a viewpoint, I'll write a later scene in that same viewpoint and then fill in with the other characters. It's just a mishmash, and I'm not the kind of person who could ever hand it to someone half finished. It's incoherent, to anybody but me, I think. And I always admire people who have like their critique circle, and they can write coherently like half a book, and it makes sense.
And speaking of critique circles, like even those are tools that work for some people and not for others.
Right.
Sometimes when you're a writer and you have such a strong vision, just giving it to critique partners just squashes that.
God.
Yeah. And if they can't see the vision you have in your head, it's just kind of pointless. You're just muddying the waters.
Well, as an editor, it's funny you say that, because as an editor, that was part of the, I'd have people, I'd buy a new book from an author, and then she'd be writing her second book and tell me her critique partners had sent her in a certain direction, and I'd say, no, they're sending you in the wrong direction. Like, listen, sort of listen to the editor. That's who you have to listen to. But a lot of times, that's so subjective. And I think when you're in the process of writing the book, you have to just hear your own voice. You have to allow your own voice to direct you. I do. Anyway, I shouldn't say that as if it's a rule, though, because, people collaborate and people are also, they have a different process.
Right. How do you keep a project moving along? Because you are so prolific, you put out so much, and if you're a pantser, and writing advice is kind of funny because you can pick up 5 books on how to write, and every one of them will give you contradictory advice. And, and you may, your situation may not apply to any of the 5.
Right.
So those are fun to read. And usually there's a tool or two that you can pick up in there, but, it's really an exercise in frustration. When it gets down to it. But there are very famous pantsers who take forever to write a book. George Martin, looking at you. And then famous pantsers like Stephen King who just crank them out,
Yep. He's amazing. And they're good.
and they're both great,
Yes.
they're both iconic authors, for a reason. But do you ever, especially when you get toward the middle of the book, that muddy middle, I like to call it, because the beginning is always exciting. The ending, a lot of us know kind of how the book is going to end, and we're writing toward that. But that middle is really funky sometimes. How do you keep it moving forward when you might not know where the story's going?
It comes down to my worst subject in school, which was math. And so I have a word count on my calendar for Fridays. I have like an electronic, my little Google calendar, and every Friday has a date. Every Friday has a word count on it. It used to be page number, but now that varies. I stick to that as much as I can, and I try to build in for travel or whatever. But I know that, to keep the book on track and deliver it on time, I have to stick to that word count, or I can write myself. You can belabor a sentence for a week if you allow yourself. So you really have to keep that forward motion going. And I remind myself that I can fix it later, and I always have to go in and fix it later. I always want to, but I just force myself to get the words down.
What's a typical Friday word count for you?
For this book, I had to keep changing it. Lately, okay, let me look. I can tell you. I'm sitting at my desk right now. So right now I'm on 5,000 words a week for the next month or so to try to get back on track with this one. That's not bad at all. Because I have a book coming out. The next one's coming out, so I know that, and I have conferences. So I'm like trying to be realistic and say, look, I'm going to be here maybe 3 of the of the 4 days, and I need 3 of the 7 days, and I need to make sure that my butt is in this chair while I'm here. So toward the end, I've written 20,000 words in a week, and in the beginning I'll write like 1,000 words in a week, because I find beginnings actually harder, because I'm always kind of nailing it down and thinking, wait, is this it or is that it? So it's always slow in the beginning, and then the momentum picks up. So that's just my process. But 5,000 is where I'm aiming for now.
So, Wendy, you've got a new series that's starting with a brand new book that's out now when people are hearing this. The new series is called the Foundlings Trilogy, and the first book is called Little Girl Lost. What can you tell us about the new series and this book in particular?
Well, I will say we're kind of backpedaling on calling it the Foundlings once we realized that a lot of people don't know what a foundling is. So I was like,
that is a sad
I don't want to
affairs.
confuse anyone. So a foundling is an abandoned baby. Sort of the baby on the doorstep kind of concept. And it's born out of my own interest in genealogy. I've been really obsessed by Ancestry.com and DNA and all of that great stuff for the last few years, and I discovered that my mom's grandfather was a foundling. That was a family story. My mom never told me, my aunt told me, but he was father of 13 kids, and it turned out he was left on a doorstep back in Sicily in the 1800s. So I was fascinated, and I thought, maybe I can figure out where he came from. Who was he really? And that sort of led to the idea that anybody who's abandoned would want to find their past and their history. Probably they'd be interested in knowing who they really are, and not everybody wants to be found. That was the piece that my editor brought to it at a lunch last year. She and I and my agent were sitting down trying to figure out what I would write next, and I gave them this pitch, and she said, well, you write suspense, so where does the suspense come in? I said, oh, I hadn't thought of that. And she said, Charles Manson has kids out there, and they don't know that they're Charles Manson's children. So that triggered something in my brain, and that's where it kind of came together. I was, not Charles Manson, but I just thought, well, what if you had a cult leader or a serial killer, or, somebody historic who was in your family tree. And that's kind of where the suspense comes in Little Girl Lost. And it's actually set, so this is a historical, believe it or not, even though it's set in 1968 and 1987. This first one, we're sort of back in time, and that's considered a historical now.
That's crazy. You really deal with the this drags up the emotions for the reader of this lifelong debate of nature versus nurture. Are we who we are because of our DNA, or are we who we are because of how we were raised? Is it some odd mix of the two? And that is something that resonates with everyone.
Everyone. You don't have to be a foundling and be searching for your roots to wonder. And that's you nailed it with that. That's exactly what my main character, her name is Amelia, and as she's searching, she's sort of, because she's been raised by a couple who loved her, and, of course you'd have resentment, and there are family secrets, and she never knew that she was a foundling, but she grows up to become an investigative genealogist because she has to come to terms with all of that as a young person, and we'll meet her again in present day in later books. But yeah, in the first book, she's struggling with that. She doesn't want to think that her real mother, who's out there somewhere, wasn't a wonderful person, or that the mother that she just lost because her mother dies, and that's not a spoiler really. She doesn't want to think that she's looking for the fairy tale, I guess, is what it is. So that's
that's one of the dangerous things about genealogy is that for every Revolutionary War hero or every European king, there are 50 scoundrels that you come across. And what do you do with that information when you get, is that something we're proud of? Is it, what does that mean to us now? When you're doing research for this book, first off, what kind of research had to go into this?
Oh, God.
Where do you start?
I actually will say, my own DNA results, all of that has been really helpful because I can see degrees of, I can see what you can find online in this day and age is really challenging because this is set, like I said. I mean, we first meet Amelia, other than as a baby, we meet her in 1987. So I had to figure out what were our capabilities in 1987. I said it then because we were on the cusp of really, I think that was the year that the first conviction came out of DNA evidence, that kind of thing. It's meticulous to figure all that out, and I don't delve deeply into the science. I'm not a scientist. I'm not, this isn't that kind of story, but even to make it authentic, it's tons of research online mostly, but a lot of books that I have, and even just to make the year authentic. I lived 1984 in New York City, but you'd be surprised how little you remember about things that you thought you remembered, So just making it, what was going on in the news on this day? What was the weather like? I want it to be authentic. What would you have been wearing? What songs were on the radio? Every time I sat down to write, I found myself having to research a little detail that would take me off on a tangent because it's fascinating. It's interesting. Oh, yeah. So that was a challenge with this one, and it took longer to write just because of the historic aspect.
Right, having to go back and fact check constantly.
Yes, and the scientific part of it, and actually, interestingly, because it is suspense, police procedural. I had to figure out, when they were investigating a crime in 1987, how did they move around the city? How did they communicate with each other? All of that was really, delving. It took days just to find a few little details here and there.
That conversation you had with your editor when she said, "Where does the suspense come in?" When you're writing not just this series but your other suspense as well, what makes the suspense in the relationships with the people in the book? Is it what do you? I guess what I'm asking is, what do you look for? When you're building kind of the case for this book in your mind? Are you looking for danger to put the person in? Are you looking for a relationship gone bad? What usually kind of instigates that suspenseful feeling that we get in the book?
In this case, there's a killer, the Brooklyn Butcher, who had been active in the 60s and is serving life sentence, and now somebody seems to be reenacting, I guess, the butcher's crimes. So there's always that ticking clock and sort of the shadowy figure, and you don't know how this is all going to come together or how it's connected. So that's a traditional suspense plot, I would say, but for me in this book and this whole trilogy is a departure because a lot of the suspense comes from this young woman who's wondering who she is, and it's a quest that is not easily solved, and she will grow up to help other people solve their own past because she can't kind of quite figure out who she is. So for me, there's suspense right there because you're going to be wondering, just as she is, who is she? Where did she come from? There are little tantalizing clues. There are some shadowy secondary characters who cross her path who seem to know more than they're letting on about the night she was found. She was found on Mother's Day, 1968, in a church in Harlem. In the middle of the night, she was abandoned there. So she has a couple of relics from her past. She found things that her mother had, and those are clues, and it all weaves into a much bigger story. So that's the inherent suspense in terms of character, I would say. That's the internal conflict that's unfolding. And also, I would say if you read The Black Widow, which was the third of my my social media thrillers, and then the next three books were my Monday's Landing trilogy. There was a character, a cop. His name was Stockton Barnes. He's an NYPD missing persons detective, and there's kind of a bombshell that he reveals at the end of Bone White, the last Monday's Landing book. So he played right into this. I realized it all sort of was unfolding in my head without my realizing it. It's like, oh my God, this is his prequel. Like, we're going to find out why he is the way he is, and he made a terrible decision in his youth. We're going to see that now. So his story is interwoven here. And I know this all sounds really complicated. It's not. It's just, I love it when pieces fall into place, and I feel really intelligent. I didn't mean to do that, So that's another piece.
Is this the first time that you've had kind of an overlap between series like that? It would seem like as many books as you've written and as much world building as you've done. Do you have characters that interact between series?
Yeah, I've done a few little walk-ons here and there. This is the biggest and the most prominent, only because my readers, and I heard from them, they love Stockton Barnes and his partner, Sully, his female partner. So I just kept writing him back in because it worked for that. But this is the biggest. I did fictionalize a setting that I used in not just a few of my suspense novels, but also some of my Wendy Markham I wrote women's fiction, so a totally different kind of story, but set in the same town. I fictionalized the town I live in now, and it's Glen Haven Park, New York. That's the name of the fictional town, and I used it. I used that, yeah, definitely. And then, like I said, in my Lilydale series, the first series was a paranormal series for young adults. And in this new mystery, it's cozy mystery, traditional mystery, you re-meet, that's not even a word, but you reconnect with the characters. Like my young adult heroine is grown up and she's back as of book 2, and you find out what happened to them all these years later. That was my way of resurrecting them, even though the series, the publisher dropped the series. So
I love it. Wendy, as someone who's been publishing for north of 25 years, are there things that you still do today in your creative process that you did then? And maybe what is the biggest change that you as a writer have gone through in that period?
The thing I still do today is when I'm home, I write a full, my butt is in this chair early in the morning, and I don't leave until my words for the day are done. Usually I work a really long day, and I work 7 days a week while I'm home. That has always been my work ethic. The thing that's changed is one piece of it is the travel and the promoting, but the other big change and the challenge now is having to be online, sort of having to maintain a social media presence. I love it. Don't get me wrong. And I'm the nosiest person in the world, so I have fun on Facebook. I love, love connecting with people. I'm social. I have a solitary job, so it's really fun. But that is a huge distraction. The electronic noise is really hard to turn off, and that was never an issue before. I still am trying to find the right balance because you can't really take a huge step back. Well, your marketing and PR people will tell you you cannot afford to not be out there and connecting. And I love connecting with readers. But that's the biggest challenge and the hugest change I've seen.
Wendy, the new book, when people are hearing this, is out now. It's called Little Girl Lost. I'm super excited for this series. I can't wait to see how it's all going to unfold. If people are just discovering you for the first time, where can they connect with you? Maybe your website where they can kind of dig in to get your full back catalog. Just where can people connect with you?
Yeah, actually my website, I'm really proud of it because it's newly unveiled. I had the world's oldest dinosaur of a website going back 25 years. So I finally had a chance, the great people at Book Reporter just redid it, and it's finally back up and running. And now, because my readers had asked, all of my books are sort of broken out, not just by genre, but by which books go in which order, and what do you have to read, and are they standalones. So the website is great. It's wendycorsistaub.com. But like I said, Facebook, I've been traveling, so I haven't been on there for the last few weeks, but I am usually, I love to be on there and connect with readers, and I love it. It's interesting to me. So that's, it's Wendy Corsi Staub is Facebook, and then just find me there, because I love that. I should be doing less of it, but I love it.
I know it's that, I don't know. Yeah, it's the necessity, and the addiction at the same time.
It is. Oh, the shiny object. Look, I don't have to work right now because I can I can look at someone's vacation pictures, a person I've never met. But
right.
It's just it's interesting to me.
It is. Yeah. Wendy, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. I feel like we could talk all day, but I know we have a word count goal. So
yeah, word count goals. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
On the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, Joey locked the doors of the Washington Irving Chapel and checked the windows from the outside, making sure that the cemetery offices were dark. Satisfied, he donned a knit cap and trudged uphill to the employee parking lot. He'd forgotten how desolate the grounds became at night. A fog had gathered, blurring the moon and stars. His rusty Volkswagen Beetle, christened Ladybug by Jason, sat in shadow alongside his dad's white van, which bore an image of the horseman and the cemetery's web address. Joey swept a palmful of condensation from Ladybug's windshield and fumbled for his keys. He heard a laugh, high and young. He froze. "Hello?" He shook off gooseflesh and found his key. He started the engine and backed out, headlights off, praying not to knock over a headstone, again. A child stood on the hillside amongst the graves. "You okay, kid? Cemetery's closed." He turned on his headlights. The child vanished. Joey idled in the drive, frowning. What had just happened? He turned off the headlights and waited for his eyes to adjust. The silhouette reappeared. The child stood in the road now, blocking his way. He and the ghost stared at each other. He bit his tongue and squinted over the steering wheel. He couldn't resolve the ghost's features, only a tiny body in ruffles? Yes, a dress. A little girl with shoulder-length hair. The figure crouched, threw its arms over its head and skipped away. A giggle followed after. The ghost skipped up the hill, turned around, and beckoned through the fog. "Please come." Joey shook his head. No way. Ain't gonna happen. But he felt compelled to follow. What could a little girl do to him after all? He would keep a safe distance. The gravel sounded like soft rain beneath his tires. It drew him helplessly, past weeping cypresses and mausoleums blue with moonlight. He followed the giggle, the skipping ribbons, the little body made of shadow and quicksilver. The north end of the cemetery grounds rose to a steep wooded slope. The ghost had led him to Section 77, the northernmost boundary of the cemetery, but he'd lost her. He killed the engine, summoned his courage, and climbed out. The night air brought him fully awake. "Where are you?" he whispered, scanning the graves. A row of diseased hemlock trees stood at the fence line. Joey knew them well. They were dying, infested by some parasite called, he fished for the name, woolly adelgig. His crew had cut them back many times, lopping off limbs and heads, trying to save them. The hemlocks had grown back twisted and tormented. They stood as a row of grotesque sentinels guarding the threshold of the forest. The ghost climbed the slope, spun at the fence, and sat hugging her knees. The black mass of the Rockefeller State Park Preserve loomed behind her. "What do you want?" Joey whispered. "Play." He stepped forward, hands shaking. He just wanted to see her face, the face of a real ghost. To see the curve of her cheek, the sparkle that might have been her left eye. "Come and play, Joey." He froze. The sound of his name terrified him. She pointed over his shoulder. "Play with us." He turned and realized his mistake. He'd driven with his eyes on the girl, trying not to lose her, never looking behind. They had been followed.